Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that shook a small community nestled in the Mountains of Appalachia. In 1897, Zona Heaster Shue, also known as the Greenbrier Ghost, died of presumably natural causes. That was until her spirit visited her mother a staggering 4 times to explain to her mother that it wasn't natural causes, but her husband Edward that killed her in a fit of rage. The autopsy that they performed on the exhumed body actually supported the spirit's account of the events. This is the only known case where the testimony of a spirit was actually used in court to convict a murderer. Now, this one is not for the faint of heart, so viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Horror History and Haunting. I'm your host, Christina. As always, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I really do appreciate you. And now on with the story. Zona Hester was born in 1875 or 1876, and she was the only daughter of 7 children. She grew up in a small farm a stone's throw away from the community called Livesey's Mill. This community was part of the Midland Trail in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, located in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Being the only girl, she was doted on by her family, her mom, dad, and brothers. She was known to be a very happy, hardworking young woman. She was often seen traveling to and from her family's farm on a horse-drawn carriage, bringing goods to trade there at Livesey's Mill. Her parents were very religious, and regularly they did take their 7 kids to church on Sunday. When she became a young woman at 16, her parents felt that she was mature enough to hitch the horse to the wagon and take the goods to market on her own. This was around the time a young man caught her eye. George Woodridge was a son of a farmer, and when Zona would bring her goods to trade at the market, her and George got to know each other, and they would sneak away for some private time, and they ultimately fell in young love. In the spring of the same year, Zona's parents discovered that she was actually pregnant with George's child. Unfortunately, her parents wouldn't let her marry young George because they felt like he couldn't make enough money to support himself, her, and a young child. This must have been devastating to them both. And it must have been somewhat of a scandal in the community. Now, on a cold November day in 1895, Zona gave birth to a little boy. But her happiness was very short-lived. The baby passed away a couple months later. The boy was never christened, and he was never given a name. So because of this, the baby couldn't be buried at the church cemetery and could not have like a church funeral. So they ended up burying the little boy on the Hester farm. The passing of the little boy also ended Zona and George's relationship. Zona was understandably inconsolable for months. She cried continuously and refused to leave the farm. Her mother Mary would pray every day to God for her daughter to hopefully live one day without the shame and sadness that her daughter was suffering with. Over time, Zona's heart did heal, and she was able to start interacting with the outside world a little more. At this point, Zona and her mother Mary became very close, and when they were seen out in public, people often mistook them as sisters. Mary's greatest wish for Zona was that one day she would be able to meet a man that could support her, and she could have a family and have a happy life full of love and contentment. It took until the spring of 1896 for Zona to actually start branching out and going back to Livesey's Mill with the goods from the farm, and she started going back to church and interacting with her friends more. On one of these trips to town, she met a man. He was going by the name Edward Shue, and he had this really weird nickname. They called him Trout. She found out Trout was the new blacksmith in town, and he rented the 2-story house that sat behind the blacksmith that had like a walking trail to and from the blacksmiths. It was actually owned by the founder of the town, Will Livesay, up until he passed away, and then it stayed vacant until Trout moved in. Trout's loud nature and his charisma really drew Zona in, and she really took a liking to the guy. He appeared to be a very handsome, hardworking young man. All the people in the community were drawn to Trout and the blacksmith shop, so the young people would kind of go in and hang out and listen to Trout's stories. And this was an activity that Zona participated in. She looked forward to when she would go into town. Now, Zona's mother at first was overjoyed to see Zona smiling again and looking forward to activities involving her friends and going back into Livesley's mill. But when Mary met Trout in person, she took an instant disliking to the man. She felt that something was off about him. Mary also felt that he was too flirtatious with the young girls and bragged a little too much for her liking. As it would turn out, Mary's intuition about Trout was right, but no one would really realize that until it was too late for Zona. Unknown to anyone there in town, Trout had a very dark past. He actually moved to the community to try to distance himself from that past. His name wasn't even Edward Shue. It was actually Erasmus Scribbling Shue. He grew up on Stoop Mountain in West Virginia, which is located in Pocahontas County. He was one of 7 brothers and sisters. Even as a young age, he was known to be very short-tempered. People would commonly describe him as being spoilt by his parents. Unknown to the people of Livesley Mill, he had actually been married 2 times before. His first wife, Ellen, they used to call her Allie, Asteline Cutlip, she was actually very abused by Trout when they were married, and he was not a good provider for her. Often, Trout would disappear for days with no explanation, and then in 1887, when they had their first child, Gerda, which was 2 years into their marriage, his behavior became even more erratic. Then in 1888, which is right around Gerda's first birthday, Trout come home, told his wife to pack her and her daughter's things and get out of his house. And when she told him no, he took all their belongings and threw them out on the street. He then took all his personal belongings, packed them up, and left. Now, he kind of drifted around and what really wasn't doing that well for himself. He ended up being caught stealing a horse and was convicted of that charge. He was tried and convicted in 1899. He was sentenced to 2 years, but he only served 22 months at the Moundsville State Penitentiary. Allie filed for divorce while he was in prison. She figured that it was the safest way to protect her and Gerda from his anger at her for filing for a divorce, because if he's locked up, he can't bother them. It was granted in November of 1889. Trout was released in December of 1890. He returned to Droop Mountain, but he never contacted Ellie or Gerda ever again. Trout then remarried a girl. Her name was Lucy Ann Tritt. She was only 16 years old, and they got married in 1894. They moved to Hillsboro, West Virginia, and lived in a house together. Now, in mid-February, Trout said that he was on the roof of their house fixing some recent weather damage, and he was throwing bricks off the roof. And as he was doing that, he didn't know Lucy had come out to give him a drink of water. She didn't see him. This is from what he said. He threw the brick off, it hit her in the head, and ultimately it killed her. Lucy's family thought that it really wasn't an accident, that he meant to kill her, but because there was no witnesses and there was no evidence to the fact, there wasn't any charges brought up on her death. It was ruled an accident. They were only married for 8 months when Lucy died. And he really showed no remorse over his 2 previous marriages. He would often talk to his friend and brag about how his 2 marriages really didn't matter because God told him he was going to have 7 wives before he died. Now, after Lucy died, he became a drifter and he found work wherever he could find it. And that's how he found out that the owner of the blacksmith in Livesay's mill was looking for a smithy. And that's how he ended up there. He moved there and then rented the house there in Livesay's mill. Shortly after Mary, Zona's daughter, met Trout, somebody in the community told her parents that they were meeting together, and her parents confronted her and forbid her from seeing him. Like, they just didn't want her messing around with this guy. When Zona told Trout what her parents had said, he immediately asked her to marry him and elope away with him. So that night, she took all of her belongings and she snuck away from the farm and she headed to the blacksmith shop. There at the blacksmith shop, she hid her stuff away. She met with Trout. They went all the way to Lewisburg to get married. Now, Zona decided not to wear white because the community already knew that she had a child and she wasn't married. So she wore a dress that she made over the summer that was like a deep red with a high decorative collar around the neck. She stopped on the way and took her time to braid some wildflowers she found and some colored leaves into her hair before the ceremony. And they were officially married on October 20th, 1896. They traveled back to Livesay Mill. They went to the blacksmith shop. Zona retrieved all her personal effects, and they walked up the hill and started living life as a married couple in the house that Trout was renting. Immediately, Trout started to change and become more demanding towards Zona. Now, because Zona's parents didn't approve of the marriage and they eloped, her parents refused to come to the house, and they never came to the house to visit or anything. A few weeks later, after moving into the home and living as husband and wife, Zona started feeling very ill, and so she went to Dr. Knapp, the town physician, to confirm that she was possibly pregnant. The doctor explained to her that it was too early to really tell, but it was definitely likely. Now, this made Zona extremely happy, and she beamed with the glow of her pregnancy. She was so happy because if she was pregnant, that means her parents would forgive her for eloping with Trout, and they would start visiting because of the baby, and Trout may love her even more and not be so hard on her as he had been lately. So she was so excited about this pregnancy. Now, one day, even though she was feeling very sickly over the pregnancy, she didn't want to disappoint her husband by not providing the evening meal that he's used to. So she forced herself out of bed and she fixed him dinner before he come up the hill at the end of the day. Now, she knew the meal that she fixed was a simple meal, but she felt that it was hearty enough to fill a hungry stomach, and that's what was important. Now, what's weird about that day is Trout usually took that track up and down the hill to his house multiple times a day. For some reason that day he didn't. He said it was because he was so busy that day. And instead he decided to go across the road to Martha and Reuben Jones's house instead. Now, everyone in the community knew Martha as Aunt Martha, and they also knew that she was a slave before the Civil War. And Trout asked if they could have their son, young Andy, go up and check on Zona and see if there was any errands that she needed ran or if she needed the eggs collected that day. Now, Martha agreed to let her son Andy go, but he had to finish his work at Dr. Knapp's house first, and then he would go out. And this seemed to agitate Trout for some reason. He got angry. Now, about an hour later, when he was done with Dr. Knapp's house, he made the trip up the hill to Trout and Zona's house. Now, Andy later said that he made this trip many times to help Zona out with grocery errands or to get the eggs or small little chores around the house. But this specific time on January 23rd felt very different to him. When he reached the stoop of the front door, he saw a small trickle of blood on the porch. He knocked on the door, no one answered. Andy opened the door. He followed the small trail of blood to the stairs in the house, and that's where he found Zona laying at the foot of the stairs. Andy bent down, shook the young woman's shoulders, tried to see if she was okay, but when he touched her, he knew something was wrong because she was stiff and cold. In a panic, he ran out of the house, ran to his mother Martha, told her what he'd found. Martha then took Andy up to the blacksmith's shop. They told Trout that Andy had found Zona at the foot of the stairs and she wasn't moving. Now, Trout dropped everything that he was doing and he screamed at Martha to go get Dr. Knapp, and he sprinted up the hill to his house. It took some time for Martha to get to Dr. Knapp's house and for Dr. Knapp to pack up his supplies and make his way all the way to the Shue residence. In that short amount of time, Trout had picked up Zona's body, carried her upstairs to their bedroom, bathed her, dressed her in her red dress with a high lace collar that she was married to him in. He had also placed a black veil over her head. Now, Trout, of course, claimed that she must have fell down the stairs or, she had some sort of complication with the pregnancy and died. When Dr. Knapp tried to examine Zona's body, Trout became very agitated. And at this point, he even threatened the doctor to get away from her. Now, he especially got agitated when the doctor was trying to look at Zona's throat, which was underneath that high lace collar. Trout would pull Zona up to him, up under his cheek and chin, and hold her tightly and shove the doctor away. He didn't want that doctor touching her in any way, shape, or form. Now, Dr. Knapp, knowing Zona was possibly pregnant and seeing Trout so distraught, he just decided to declare that it was complications due to pregnancy, which is what we would call miscarriage nowadays, that must have caused her death, and then he left because they figured he would just let Trout mourn his wife. The next morning, Zona's body was transported to the Hester family farm. They placed her body in her old childhood room, and as customary for the time, they began sitting up with the dead, which just meant that the family members wouldn't leave the body until it was time to take her body to the church for the funeral. Now, during this vigil, Trout refused to leave the head of his wife's coffin. He also placed a very full pillow behind her head. He knotted up a sheet and placed it on one side of her head, and then he wrapped a heavy scarf around her neck. And at this time, he claimed that those were wishes that she made for whenever it would happen that she would pass away, but the family knew nothing about these strange requests at the time. The funeral was held at the Soul Chapel there within the community. It was a very short funeral. She kissed her daughter's cheek. She removed the pillow and the knotted sheet from the coffin so the coffin lid would fit. And then they fastened the coffin lid to the coffin. They carried the coffin from the church out to the cemetery, and then she was buried. Mary then also placed a wreath of pine needles because it was wintertime, so there was no flowers on her grave after she was buried. Mary was understandably very distraught about her daughter's death, but also she had this nagging feeling that Zona's soul wasn't at rest, and there was something about her death that just was not right. Everyone else was asleep. She would sneak away from her husband's bed and then lie on Zona's childhood bed in her room. Through all her tears, she would cry out to God to help her find a way to let Zona's soul rest in peace. Then one night, it seemed like her prayers were answered, and there was this glowing doorway that opened in the corner of the bedroom, and Zona came out of this doorway, and she went on to explain to her mother what had actually happened to her. Mary was terrified, but she was also overjoyed at seeing her daughter again, but all she could do was basically stand there in stunned silence. Zona stood before her dressed in the dress that she was buried in, the red dress with a high collar, and basically told her mother the horrible truth about her death. That day she was feeling ill because of the baby, and she didn't feel up to cooking any meat for the dinner. But she still prepared a hearty meal, but it just consisted of bread, butter, apple, preserved pears, cherries, and 3 kinds of jelly. The fact that there was no meat angered Trout and threw him into a rage. He ended up squeezing her neck so hard with his bare hands that he crushed her windpipe, the blood come out of her mouth, and he actually broke her neck in the process. And during the argument, Trout also took all her personal items, placed them in a basket, a woven basket, and ruined them, and then placed them in the cellar. Now, Zona told Mary specifically where to look in the house to show the blood trail, that there was a struggle and where that happened, and where her ruined items in the basket, where he had placed them to hide them. Now, for 3 days, Mary was having the same visitation by Zona. She was very frightened and confused about this, and she felt like people would think she was crazy if she told them, so she didn't tell her family or her friends what was going on. But the 4th visitation was different, because when Zona got done telling her everything that she has done the past 3 nights, when she went to walk her away, her head turned completely backwards, and her mom said her face was so sad that she couldn't contain it anymore. So she finally told her family what was happening. They told her that she should visit the prosecutor in town. She told a couple friends in town that was going on, and they also said that she should go to the prosecutor in town and have an investigation done to see if Zona was murdered. And what she did, she walked up to the prosecutor's house, knocked on the door, went in, told him everything that had happened, and to her surprise, the prosecutor believed her. He had Trout picked up by the sheriff and detained in a local cell, and then he filed with the court to get Zona's body exhumed for an autopsy. Now, once they got the documentation approving the autopsy, they exhumed her body. They took her body to the small 1-room schoolhouse that was there in the community, that was very close to the cemetery. They put 2 tables together, placed her body on it. Now, there was 3 doctors that performed the actual autopsy. They had 5 witnesses from town. They also made Trout be present. There was a constable, a justice, and of course the sheriff. Now, before they got started with the autopsy, Trout was, of course, saying that it was an accident, that she must have fell down the stairs, that he never hurt her, and da-da-da-da-da. Now, what was strange is when they did the autopsy, they confirmed a lot of the details Zona told her mother during her visit. One of which was when they opened her stomach, she had eaten the fruit and the preserves that she had specifically told her mother about. Also, when they examined her neck, there were finger-shaped bruises around her neck. Her neck was also dislocated between the 1st and 2nd vertebrae, and her windpipe was completely crushed, and there were ligaments that were broken in there, and some of those ligaments were also ruptured. I mean, he completely crushed her neck. Now, they also examined her uterus, and they didn't see any signs of pregnancy, but I think it was just too early to tell for that time period to actually see a pregnancy, because they don't have the tests and things that they do nowadays. Mary also led officials to specific locations in the home where they found the blood trail, the signs of a struggle. They found where he had hid the ruined items that Zona had told her about. Trout was then formally arrested for the murder of Zona, and his trial was ultimately set for June 23rd, 1897. Now, Mary rented a room at the Lewisburg boarding house so she could attend every day of the court hearing. Now, people and newspapers came from all around when they heard about the unusual circumstances surrounding this court case. It even got the attention of ASPR, which stood for the American Society of Psychical Research, and they were located in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, they were a group of well-regarded scientists and scholars that were interested in studying things like ESP, psychic phenomenon, telepathy, hypnosis, and the possibility of life after death. Now, they were also the pioneers that paved the way for psychology, physics, and astronomy. Mary would later write them letters describing in extreme detail about her encounter with Zona, and she even listed out all the people that she told about her experience with Zona. They would be later published into the Journal of American Society of Psychical Research. Mary was ultimately called to the stand for her testimony. On the last day of June, the last arguments of the prosecution and defense was held. It only took the 12 members of the jury a little over an hour to find Trout guilty of first-degree murder. Now, he narrowly escaped the death penalty by a 10-4-2 against vote. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. He would be held at the Lewisburg jail until he could be transferred to the Moundsville State Penitentiary. Now, the public was so angered at the fact that Trout didn't get the death penalty that they formed multiple mobs to try to get him and lynch him for the murder of Zona. But somehow they were finally able to get Trout to the state penitentiary on the 14th of July. But this was after several warrants were issued for the different leaders of the different lynch parties to kind of deter them from stopping him from getting into the Moundsville State Penitentiary. Now, while Trout was there, there's no record of anyone ever visiting him. Not his parents, not his siblings, no one came to visit him in prison. He often would draw pictures. Anytime he found a pencil and a piece of paper, they were often just depictions of himself and Zona. Now, I'm not sure if he was just trying to deal with what he did to Zona, or if the rumors were true that Zona was actually visiting him in prison and haunting him over her murder. Now, 3 years into his life sentence, Trout caught influenza and passed away. And just like with the visitation, no one from the Shue family came to claim the body. So he was buried at Whitegate Cemetery, which was the cemetery that the unclaimed body of the prisoners from the Moundsville State Penitentiary, that's where they would bury them. Now, back then they used to use wooden crosses to mark everybody's grave at Whitegate Cemetery. But in 1927, there was a huge flood that came through that area and washed all those crosses away. So no one knows exactly where Trout is buried or where some of the other prisoners are buried at that cemetery. So, do you think Zona come back from the dead to tell her story? Do you think that Trout got what he deserved in the end? Do you think that Trout was being haunted by Zona while he was in prison? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you for watching till the end. And as always, have a good night and sweet dreams.